Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the movie. I miss you guys. Haven't seen you in a long time, so I just want to say hello and hope you're doing well. Before we get started, I do want to introduce our guest here today. It's Mr. Joseph McBride. I'll wait for the applause to die down. Okay, great. Mr. McBride is a film historian, author, screenwriter, and educator, currently teaching in San Francisco, but originally from Wauwatosa, isn't that right?
That's right.
Born in Milwaukee.
Born in Milwaukee, raised in Wauwatosa.
Well, welcome back.
Good to be here.
Virtually.
Yeah.
So I watched it tonight. Some of you I know watched it in the past couple of days, but we watched Orson Welles' film, The Stranger. And the reason we got Joseph here to talk to us is because you are an authority on Orson Welles. Is that correct?
Well, I've been studying him since 1966 when I went to college in Madison, UW. And I was going to be a journalist and novelist. And then I saw Citizen Kane in a film class. And that set me on my, 54-year study of Welles to date. And it's an endless study. But his career is not yet over, as I keep telling people.
Yeah.
He left a lot of unfinished work and a lot of riddles and a vast amount of work that we're studying and reevaluating all the time.
So that checks out as expert then, I would imagine.
I would hope so.
Sounds about right. For those who aren't as familiar with his films and with him as a person, can you give a brief description sort of his significance and contribution to film?
Well, Jean-Luc Godard, the great French director, said all of us will always owe him everything, for he's the one who started up that little train engine. And that was a reference to when Welles was on the set of Citizen Kane, his first Hollywood feature. He said, this is the greatest railroad train any boy ever had. And it was part of his joy of filmmaking. And I responded to that when I first saw his film. He was 24 when he made Kane, and I was very excited that a young guy could make a film like that. And he's from Wisconsin, which got me excited. He was born in Kenosha.
Right.
Spent a year in Madison. And his mother was a concert pianist who performed in Milwaukee and various places. Pat McGilligan did a really good book called Young Orson, which is about his life up to the moment when he says, roll him on Citizen Kane. So it's like a 700-page book of his early life that shows you how prodigious he was. And he revolutionized filmmaking with Kane and other great films. Magnificent Ambersons, his second feature, is my favorite film of all time. That was severely mutilated by the studio, and that started a pattern of all kinds of destructive attacks on his work. Although Kane had raised the ire of William Randolph Hearst, the publisher who it was loosely based on, and that was a very cheeky thing for Welles to satirize this fascistic publisher, and the studios and the exhibitors and the media were against him largely. I mean, he always had a lot of admirers, but I think the best thing said about him in terms of his career was Jean Renoir said that Welles was an aristocrat working in a popular medium, and those two things do not go hand in hand. So he rarely had a success. Actually, the only film of his that made money on its first run was The Stranger, the film you just seen. And it's ironically suffered for that reason, which I don't think is quite fair. He never had a mass audience. I heard him once tell us at a luncheon that he started out to want to be the American Charles Dickens, the epitome of the popular artist. And he regretted he never had Dickens's popular audience. So he was an avant-garde filmmaker his whole life. And then he had to go to Europe. He was blacklisted. He was a progressive, anti-fascist, as you can see in The Stranger, which is about fascism. And he worked in Europe for a long time. He came back to America in 1970 and made The Other Side of the Wind, a film that I acted in for 5 years. I was writing my first book on Welles in Wisconsin and happened to get into that film, playing a critic. And so I knew him in the last 15 years of his life. And I wrote a book, Whatever Happened to Orson Welles, which is started out being about that period, which is the least understood of his life. He made a lot of films he was shooting all the time, but a lot of them didn't get finished. And that caused some controversy. Some people attacked him for that. But we don't attack Kafka for not finishing his novels or Schubert for writing the unfinished symphony.
Right.
Wells was just an overflowing, prodigious filmmaker, one of a kind. So he's inspired filmmakers. As Truffaut said, Citizen Kane prompted the most filmmakers to want to become filmmakers, and that's one of the great things he did.
Now, in his later life, did he not understand the effect he had in his earlier career had on people during his later career?
Oh, well, he knew that he was revered, and he would get sort of impatient when people would bring up Kane. He didn't want to talk about it. Like I saw Rob Reiner try to bring up Kane on a talk show once, and he wouldn't talk about it. He got tired of hearing about his youthful achievements because that's mostly what people talked about. And they didn't see his later films. For example, a lot of people in his later years would say he was a failure, blah, blah, blah. And I'd say, have you seen Chimes at Midnight? And inevitably they hadn't heard of it.
Oh, yeah.
And it was hard to see, but that was, the distributor lost faith in the film because it got attacked in the New York Times. And it hardly played in America, and it took forever to get onto Criterion DVD and Blu-ray. So many people hadn't had a chance to see it until recently. He wanted people to know the totality of his work in Europe and America, and he was frustrated that films were being stopped from wide release or coming out, but he was a guy of great spirit. He never gave up despite all the obstacles, and he loved one of his crew and cast guys on the other side of the wind said he just loved shooting film every day. That's what he lived for. John Ford said the same thing, but Ford worked well in the commercial system, and Wells did not.
Yeah. Now, let's dig into the film at hand, The Stranger. The first thing I would really be interested to hear you talk about is the beginning of the film that never happened, the sequence that Wells originally wanted to be in the film. Can you talk a little bit about what it was and what happened to it?
Yeah, The Stranger, he said he made to prove to Hollywood that I don't glow in the dark, is the way he put it. He hadn't been allowed to direct a film since Amberson's and It's All True, a South American documentary project, was canceled in the middle of shooting. And they were wary of him. He had a false reputation as a profligate filmmaker. He really was not, actually. But The Stranger was a commercial enterprise. It was a somewhat conventional thriller. It was somewhat like Hitchcock's Shadow of a Doubt, and other directors could have made that film. It wasn't as unusual as Kane or Amberson's, but he tried to put in some things that were distinctive. For example, there was supposed to be a long sequence at the beginning of the film in South America. There is a short sequence you see now where they let this Nazi escape to lead them to Kindler, the Wells character, and you see him being pursued in South America briefly, but it was supposed to be a much longer section, and you can read the script if you can find it online. And it was going to be about 20 minutes long, very elaborate, very expressionistic, and remnants of that kind of style are in the film. He also had some dream sequences and some nightmares, and he was going to get into the subconscious dream life of the Loretta Young character. That was going to be a major theme in the film, of the kind of the awakening of the American public symbolically to the evil living amongst them. That's kind of the theme of the film. And she was this kind of naive, well-intentioned American woman who falls in love with a Nazi and resists that knowledge. And it deals with her sexual, conflicts. And so it had a kind of there was an expressionistic, larger than life quality that they did everything to kind of cut down to more conventional tone. He also wanted Agnes Moorehead to play the investigator, and that would have been very interesting. She was a great, great actress, of course, and one of his favorites, and they insisted on Edward G. Robinson, who's a great actor, but Wells said he thought it was predictable casting.
Yeah, you mentioned that, and I thought that was a fascinating
Yeah.
possibility that could have happened. Would have made a very different tone to that film, especially at that time, I guess.
Yeah, so I should say in my first book on Wells, I really beat up on this film. And I think I was partly taking a cue from Wells, who disparaged the film a lot, saying it was the only film of his he didn't have a lot of regard for because it was made under studio conditions. He didn't have a lot of control. But Over the years, I've come to have more regard for it. It's a better film than I realized. And there are some remarkable things in it. I mean, just on a technical level, there's a 4-minute tracking shot in the woods in which Kindler kills his former associate. It's remarkable, great long take. Russell Meddy, the DP, and John Russell, the camera operator, who later worked on Touch of Evil, which has some of the most famous long takes in film history. And it has some of Welles's distinctive style. It also has things that are not very Wellesian, like too many close-ups of Loretta Young. You know, that's kind of conventional Hollywood filmmaking. And but it's a rather gripping thriller, and the theme of anti-fascism. And Welles is very concerned. He's what they called in the Red Scare period a premature anti-fascist, an Orwellian term, that he had been strongly speaking out against fascism in the 30s. And during the war, he was doing a lot of propaganda broadcasts, and he was writing speeches for Franklin Roosevelt. He was very concerned about the possibility of the resurgence of Nazism, neo-Nazism, and the survival of certain Nazi characters. Martin Bormann, who was one of Hitler's top deputies, was more or less the model for Kindler. And he escaped, and nobody ever found out where he went. He just kind of disappeared. It's kind of strange. There are elements, I'd say, of Heydrich and Himmler in the character too. And the word genocide is actually used in the film. It's not in the script, but in the film it says he's the creator of the genocide theory. And they show Wells shows a clip from Death Mills, which is an army documentary on concentration camps that Billy Wilder helped work on. And
he's the first person to use actual footage from the Nazi camps in his films, or
in a theatrical feature. Okay. They were in newsreels, but Wells said anytime you can show that to the public, they should see it. Yeah. And so he was trying to alert the public to the existence of fascism, the survival of fascism. The same year, Hitchcock and Ben Hecht made Notorious, which has a very similar theme about Nazis thriving in South America and trying to, create a Fourth Reich. So he was serious about the theme, and so he cared about that, and he would be writing articles. He had a column in the New York Post, and he had a radio show where he talked about politics a lot. And so it has elements of his personal themes. And also, in terms of his overall career, he's concerned very much with very powerful men who destroy themselves out of overweening pride. It's kind of a Greek tragic theme that he deals with constantly, and the tragic fall, literally in this film, as in other films, the guy falls off a tower. And there's a Shakespearean dimension. And so it has a lot of connections with Welles's other work. And he also said his films are usually a physical search. He said, I don't know why. I think it's because they're a moral search as well. So you have Robinson being our surrogate, searching for the evil in this that's insinuated itself into this archetypal American small town and exposing it to us.
That's great. I want to talk to the members real quick. As we're going to ask a couple more questions in the chat. Feel free, if you have questions, to put your questions in the chat, and our moderator Andy will filter those to me, and we'll ask those towards the end of the conversation. But also, I wanted to talk more about. We talked a little bit about Orson Welles had to make a lot of concessions. And he agreed ahead of time, I'm assuming just in order to get a movie made.
Right.
What kind of concessions did he have to deal with during the making of this? And
Sam Spiegel was the producer he had 3 Best Picture winners, Lawrence of Arabia and Bridge on the River Kwai, and another one. And but he was a very crass producer, and Welles said that when you did a Sam Spiegel film, he kind of dictated how you would do it. And Ernest Nims was the studio editor who also re-edited Touch of Evil, and he had a very hard grasp on the editing. And Nims edited the script even before the shooting and cut out a lot of it and made Welles go along with it. So Welles was not too happy about that. And so he made concessions in that regard, and but not to do those. I mean, he shot some of these dream sequences and things that were very avant-garde, One of the things I should mention, and I'm sure the participants will have some comments, one of the things I objected to at the time, I thought Welles's performance was absurd because he's so over the top. He's such an obvious villain that I thought, how could anybody in this town not realize he's an escaped Nazi? And I was looking at this from a narrow lens of naturalism, and there's a wonderful book I'd recommend highly called Orson Welles, Shakespeare and Popular Culture by Michael Anderegg. Let me just read a little. This really changed my view of the story. He said that the film is very Brechtian. Welles was very into the theories of Bertolt Brecht at the time, and he was planning to direct Brecht's play Galileo, which didn't happen. And Brecht loved Welles's play Around the World in 80 Days, which he did right after The Strangers, so they had a lot in common. And Anderegg says, Welles's Kindler is like Shakespeare's Richard Crookback, so transparent a villain, so clearly not what the all-American inhabitants of Harper, Connecticut think him to be, that America's complacency and naivete become dominant issues in the film, just as in Richard III, the imperceptiveness and doggedly willed innocence of Richard's victims create a continuous ironic tone to the drama. Welles performs in such a way that no member of the film audience could possibly make the error his fiancée and nearly everyone else with whom he comes into contact make, almost as if afraid of allowing the evil of Nazism to appear even momentarily attractive. Welles refuses to act out the charm and plausibility that other characters presumably see in Franz Kindler. Throughout The Stranger, Welles delivers even the most innocent sounding lines with the guilty subtext clearly indicated, continually providing commentary in tandem with representation. And as Anderegg points out, Brecht was a didactic, pedagogical man of the theater, as Welles was in film, and he said this was not a new thing for Welles. Welles always kind of stands apart from his characters to some extent, and you always are conscious of a performance in his great men that he portrays. And Truffaut said the secret weakness of the strong is the theme of Welles's films, and Kindler may be a very strong, evil, powerful man, but he's weak and doomed to fail. And he's constantly anxious about being exposed. And so Brecht believed in what he called making strange, which fits the title of this film perfectly, that if you do things that signal to the audience this is not naturalistic, you don't submerge yourself into the character, you're kind of educating the audience at the same time as you're doing a story. And that's totally antithetical to the Hollywood way of invisible storytelling.
Even despite all of the, I guess, criticisms of the disconnect between a typical Orson Welles film and the concessions he had to make, it still seemed like an Orson Welles film to me, stylistically, maybe not as grand visually, perhaps, but
yeah,
it's still very much visually a film that I recognized as his.
Yeah, it's got a lot of his prowling camera and his skulking evil and the shadows, and also a lot of personal references in the small town, which is really modeled on Woodstock, Illinois, which he called his Camelot. That's where he went to the Todd School for Boys, which is obviously the model for the boys' school in the film. And there are some direct references to the Todd School. He's very nostalgic for that, which is ironic. So he's talking about the evil lurking in an American small town, like Hitchcock did in Shadow of a Doubt. So it's a warning about being complacent, about don't think we're safe or protected from evil.
Right. I have a question from Nick. It says, was The Stranger controversial upon its release, given how fresh World War II and the Holocaust was in 1946?
I haven't seen any criticism of that. I think people were open to seeing and hearing about the recent Nazi horrors, because in April of 45, we began seeing the newsreels. That's where most of the public realized it. I mean, the Allies knew as early as 1942 the death camps were in operation, and if you read the press carefully, you would read that. But a lot of people didn't follow the news carefully enough. But he didn't get attacked for that. Later it became sort of people didn't want to hear about the Holocaust as much later, partly because we were trying to make friends with Germany after the war. We were rebuilding Germany and Japan, and we were afraid more of the Russians in that Red Scare period. And so the Americans at first were going to root out the remnants of Nazism, and then they started playing ball with the Nazis and letting a lot of Nazi scientists into the country and things like that. So I guess there was less emphasis on anti-German rhetoric. And so the Holocaust became a subject people didn't talk about. It wasn't even called the Holocaust for many years, or the Shoah. That came later. but people were certainly aware of the death camps, and Welles didn't get attacked, and he got some fairly good reviews for the film. Some said it was over the top, etc., but it wasn't excoriated. It just didn't make a big impact at the time.
Well, that brings me to a question I had, which since it was his most commercially successful film, what do you think it is about this film, apart from his others, that appealed to a bigger audience?
Well, I think it's easy to relate to Edward G. Robinson's character, and I suppose the women's picture angle. The women made up a huge part of the film-going audience in those days when, we've lost a lot of the habit audience. Films used to be a habit. 1946 was the biggest year in film grosses ever, and then it went into its long decline. And one of the good things about that is there were a lot of female stars who had a lot of box office clout, and because the mother and the grandmother and the grandparents and the parents and the children would all go to the movie. And so quite often, as Molly Haskell points out, the women would make the choice, let's go to see the Joan Crawford film or the Bette Davis film or Loretta Young film. So a lot of it is about the relationship with his wife. And Welles is not the greatest director of women, I would say. His view of women is more limited than other directors, although Agnes Moorehead is certainly really great in Magnificent Ambersons, and there's some other fine female performances. I think Loretta Young is a kind of weak link in the film. I think she's a bit monotonous and overly naive, but I mean, she does gradually acquire some awareness and backbone and try to stop her husband and shows some courage. Somebody pointed out there's a motif of her constantly closing curtains, which like trying to block out the world, but the world she's forced to confront it. Robinson makes her confront the Holocaust, and then she confronts her husband, and it's in theory an interesting performance, but Welles didn't like a lot of close-ups, and there was a funny story that she apparently was one of the
ask you about that.
One of the stars who would say, I'd like to be photographed on my good side, or whatever her good side was, and Welles was trying to deal with that, and then but she was very cooperative, he said. And then Edward G. Robinson chimed in, I'd like to be photographed on my good side too. And Welles said, what? Eddie Robinson has a good side. They have to deal with that kind of thing. But she gives a creditable performance, but it's not a memorable performance, I would say.
Now, Edward G. Robinson seems to have a more mild performance than he typically does in his films. He was very almost quiet in this film.
Well, he's got quite a range. I'm writing about a critical study of Billy Wilder, and Robinson had recently done Double Indemnity, where he's really great playing an investigator who's blinded to his employee, Fred McMurray, being a murderer because he loves the guy, and he comes to realize what this guy has done, and it's a powerful performance, and there's a kind of a male bonding there. So Robinson is very effective when he's low key. He's not over. I mean, he's trying to fit in. He's trying to be he's not saying, hi, I'm an Nazi war crimes investigator. He's not trying to scare people. He's trying to just say, I'm an antique purchaser happening come through town. So it's a fascinating performance. I think he's one of the great actors in film history. But he can be very menacing in other films too.
Yeah, I really enjoyed him as the essentially the hero, and Welles as the villain. Because visually, and I imagine in Hollywood at that time, they would have cast it very differently. But it was a really nice offset. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, Welles often played villainous characters in his films, and Robinson had a range. He was known as a gangster character, but he played a lot of different kinds of parts. He played victim roles or weaklings, or as in Double Indemnity, he's a very endearing, lovable, very brilliant Sherlock Holmes kind of guy. So he had a range. So Welles thought it was conventional casting. I think he meant that people were very familiar with Robinson and comfortable with him, and he liked people to be uncomfortable, and that's partly the Brechtian nature. And to have a woman playing the role would have been unconventional. And there were women investigators and women involved in the army and the Allied forces, and so it wouldn't have been totally unusual, but it would have been different for the time.
Right. It would have been lovely to see a really interesting dynamic. I have another question from one of our members. How do you think the vision of small town American life it's represented at the end as a good-hearted and willing to stand up to evil, but the world of that town seems so strangely out of proportion and overbearing. How do you think we're supposed to think of this small town dollhouse world? That's
Well,
what.
I think you hit on something that it is, Wells is mocking it and satirizing it to some extent, its complacency and its insularity. And, you see this square, it's a studio back lot, but it looks sort of convincing as a small town. I mean, Woodstock has a town square just like that. It's a fixture of American small town life. But Wells said the thing he liked best in the film was the guy in the drugstore, the old fellow, Billy House,
Right.
philosophical kind of wisecracking guy who knows everybody and sees everybody, and he's somebody said he's kind of unpleasant. I don't find him unpleasant. I find him rather charming, but he's kind of a busybody. And well, he was an old burlesque comedian that Wells loved. He'd never made a film, and Wells said he sweated for like 3 days. He was very anxious, and Wells said, "What can I do to help this wonderful actor? Why is he so uncomfortable?" Because Wells was, I saw as an actor myself, Wells loved actors. He did everything possible to make actors feel good, except me. He was bullying me for 3 years until somebody said he likes your performance. I thought, oh, okay, so I relaxed. But he was tough on the crews, but he really loved actors. He thought they're the most important people. But Billy House said, well, there's this guy over in the corner there. He's staring at me all the time. And Wells realized it was his stand-in, who was a guy who looked like him. And House thought if he wasn't good, he was going to be replaced. So Wells said, no, you've got the part, But Wells liked that. He's kind of like the chorus in a Greek play. And Robinson, he's sort of Robinson's conduit. But I think Wells is making fun of the town to some extent. You have the Supreme Court Justice, who's an important figure, but he's very naive. And, there's this fascist married to his daughter he doesn't seem to notice,
Yeah.
And in the script, there's a line where there's a cocktail party and somebody said he's as important a figure as Oliver Wendell Holmes or Louis Brandeis. That's pretty good company, but he doesn't seem to be a terribly smart man.
Oh, right.
Her brother seems like a sympathetic and fairly intelligent young guy, and Robinson chooses him to share the secret with and get him on his side. But the townspeople, like in a Hitchcock film, were portrayed as clueless and naive. And I think Wells was frustrated with the insularity and naivete of American small towns. Wells was, he was a Democrat with a small d. He was popular. He believed in democratic values, et cetera, but he was an aristocratic person who was impatient with people's ignorance and lack of sophistication. And it was kind of a thorn in his side that people didn't go to see his films. And
Right.
maybe they're the audience for his films too, the audience that didn't come to his films.
Yeah. You touched on it a little bit, but I did want to ask you more about the project, The Other Side of the Wind. Can you talk, first of all, generally explain a little bit about that project? It's a complicated film that was made over a great deal of time. And then also if you would talk about your contribution to that film.
Yeah, Kristopher mentioned that a lot of you had seen The Stranger on Netflix. I was happy to hear that there's a beautiful print. One reason this film suffered for a long time, there were terrible prints out there. It was a public domain film, and the prints looked dreadful for a long time. But Kino Lorber put out a beautiful DVD, and it's a Library of Congress restoration, so it finally looks good again. But on Netflix, they also have The Other Side of the Wind, his 2018 feature, and there are 2 documentaries about it. And I'm in all 3 of these things. One documentary is called They'll Love Me When I'm Dead, which is the story of making the film and his attempts to finish it. And then there's one they don't want you to see because they didn't like the fact that it was made, that Frank Marshall made it, who was one of the producers of the restoration of Other Side of the Wind. It's called A Final Cut for Orson. You have to search for it under the trailers bar. But it's a fascinating thing for anybody who's into film because it shows all the post-production process, which was very difficult. They had like 1,000 cans of film in a Paris lab for all those years. And he started shooting in 1970, and it was his big project of his later years. As I say, he made a lot of films in later years, but this was his big reflection on his art and the industry, and it was satirical but dramatic. And the main character, Jake Hannaford, is modeled on Hemingway, he told me. Wells did. John Huston plays the part, who's wonderful, and he's, of course, a great legendary character in his own right. And Welles wanted to show the kind of what he thought was the overadulation of directors, which is ironic because he was one of the key directors who was worshipped and held up as a personal artist, but he thought it had gone too far. And he said in an article at that time that when he looked at a picture of a director on his crane, it reminded him of Mussolini on his balcony. There was a fascistic aspect to it. And so he's criticizing this director who was a sadist and toying with his actors and cruel to women. And he's like a poster child for the Me Too movement. As I've said, that he treats women very badly. And ironically, some people misunderstood the film when it came on. They said, oh, Welles doesn't like women or whatever. I mean, Welles criticizes his characters, and that's an example. Just because, I mean, Welles never made a film in which the character was just a lovable person. That's not the kind of filmmaker he was.
Right.
And so he surrounds Huston's character with all different kinds of people in Hollywood. A lot of us playing versions of ourselves, comical versions. And he cast me as a young film critic and historian who follows this guy around asking him sort of silly film buff questions that irritate him. And Peter Bogdanovich has a good part as a young director who's acolyte of his. It's sort of a Falstaff Hal story again. The young prince becomes the king and then betrays the old man, and it's a tragic story, but it's very funny at the same time. And the editing is extremely avant-garde, very fast-paced, very, very wonderfully put together by Bob Murawski, who was a young editor who finished the film in the style that Welles established. Welles edited about 40 minutes of it before he died. And he had financial problems, legal problems, political problems. The Iranian government at one point invested in the film, and then the Shah was overthrown by the Ayatollah. And the Ayatollah's agents were trying to seize the film. And I mean, it's an amazing saga. Josh Karp wrote a book about it. And my book, Whatever Happened to Orson Welles, about a third of it is on the making and post-production of this film. So we tried for a long time to get it finished, and everybody in Hollywood turned it down. I finally had the idea of going to a cable channel. This was unusual back in the 90s. And we were ahead of the time because now there's no theatrical distribution. It's all streaming now. Streaming film just grossed $100 million, the first time that ever happened. But so I said, let's go to Showtime. And Showtime actually wanted to do the film. But then Oya Kodar, Welles's partner who owned his share of the film, blocked it. And Welles's daughter, Beatrice, blocked it for a while too. And it went through this Byzantine legal thing. They fired me off the project. Peter and Oya fired me in 1999 after I made the initial deal with Showtime. They felt that they didn't need me, and the deal immediately collapsed. So I think if I had been with the film all the way through, it would have probably come out around 2004. But frankly, I'm really glad I got fired, because it would have been hell to deal with Oya for 9 years. Like Philip Yam Remza, the young producer of the film, had to haggle with her for 9 years. I've done a lot of other things in that time, and it was enough to spend 40 years trying to get the film out, but I didn't want to spend the last 10 years doing that either.
Right.
But it turned out really well. I'm very happy with the result. I was a consultant along with Jonathan Rosenbaum of Chicago, and he's a Welles critic, and we were brought into, so they really took the trouble to study, the editors studied Welles's career, and they had a lot of notes from Welles, and they had scripts and things. So they were trying very faithfully to follow his style. And he had established a style for the story, the framing story at the party. It all takes place on the last night of the life of this director. And then there's a film within the film, which is very different. And as Jonathan said, it's a radical storytelling thing to tell two stories at once. The film within the film gives you a window into the psyche, especially the twisted sexual psyche of Jake Hannaford. And it's a kind of a daring thing to intercut one storyline with another, and they did it quite well, I think, and the style is brilliantly executed. So I'd recommend people watch it.
Yeah, that movie is The Other Side of the Wind. And what was the name of the documentary, or the two documentaries about it again?
Yeah, They'll Love Me When I'm Dead, which is a line that Welles said with rueful humor. Because when an artist dies, it suddenly is much easier to deal with him. I mean,
Yeah.
frankly, once he was gone, it was easier to get the film out, but
Right.
but Ohio was more of an obstacle. Wells was really trying to get the film out, I mean, to give him his due. The other is called The Final Cut for Orson, 40 Years in the Making. And you have to search around the website. It's in
Right.
trailers and extras, I think,
And you've written two books
Three,
on
three.
three books on Orson Welles. And can you tell everyone what those are again?
Yeah, the first one I wrote in Wisconsin called Orson Welles. It was a critical study written in 66 to 70, roughly, published by the British Film Institute in the Cinema One series. And at the time I wrote it, there wasn't much on Welles in English, and a lot of books on Welles now.
Oh.
Then I wrote a short book on his acting career. It's the only book on his acting career, called Orson Welles, Actor and Director. Although Michael Andereg's book has a lot of good stuff in his acting. That's out of print, that second book. But the third one is in print, Whatever Happened to Orson Welles, A Portrait of an Independent Career, which was published in 2006. And that took a long time to write because it's unusual. It's a critical study, has a lot of biographical and memoir aspects combined with it because I was around. And I started telling the story of his last 15 years. And then I thought, to tell that story, how did this man become an independent filmmaker? Douglas Gomery, who is another guy from Madison who became a film scholar, had the theory that Welles was always primarily an independent filmmaker who just happened to have the resources of a major studio briefly. And it's a fallacy to think the opposite, which most people think in America, that he was a failed studio director. It had to go on the road and make films. It's the other way around. Douglas felt that he was really an avant-garde filmmaker, and that's kind of the theme of the book. So I had to trace his whole life and career over again in a condensed way because I was trying to keep it from getting way out of control. And so I go through his whole evolution and a lot about his political life, et cetera, and his blacklisting, and then get into his later work and what, just to tell people what's in his later films. I saw all the later films, and I had to go to Europe a lot and see them, and they're not easy to see, a lot of them.
That's great. I like, especially at a time when we're all kind of trapped in our houses, this is a great time to really dig in on something. And so revisiting this movie has kind of gotten me into that vein where I want to go revisit the ones I've seen, catch up on the ones I haven't seen, and read about it. So if anyone is out there feeling the same way I am, here's some great sources for you. I have a couple more. I have a couple last questions from the members about The Stranger, and then I have a final question, and we'll wrap it up for tonight. But I have a question from Bernadette that says, the investigator suspects the protagonist is a Nazi because he says Karl Marx is not a German but a Jew. While that would have been a common sentiment for a Nazi, anti-Semitism was widespread, including in the U.S. Is there information that this comment would have been suspicious for an American to say at that time?
That's a really good point, because that gets kind of to the theme of the film I was talking about, that it raises our eyebrows today because it's such an obvious tip-off. This guy is an anti-Semite, because who else but a Nazi or fascist would deny that Marx was a German because he was a Jew? And it's like in Shadow of a Doubt when Joseph Cotten lets out with some homicidal remarks at the dinner table. But in the film The Stranger, the only person who, Edgar G. Robinson is shown, but he knows the secret, but he's shown reacting. But the other people kind of let it skate, except for the young man who, he's sort of more sophisticated. He's the one who quotes Marx in the first place. But the other people at the table don't seem terribly to get the point of that. And that's kind of a tip-off of that Brechtian distance, that we get something. It's a message from the author directly to us that the characters are not privy to, the guilty subtext. He's letting his psyche loose, and we get it and they don't.
Right.
So we critique them, we criticize them and see their flaws in that culture. And you're right that in America, from what I've read, anti-Semitism was much more common in the 30s than after the war, that the war had educated people to some extent. First of all, people being in the service, and also just the experience of war against the Nazis and the revelations of the death camps and all the other horrors. People were less anti-Semitic after the war. They were very blatant about it before the war, and even some people who we think are heroic people like Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt had streaks of anti-Semitism in them. And the New York Times, which was owned by a Jewish family, covered up the Holocaust for years. There's a book called Buried by the Times, which is very disturbing about how they really didn't report the Holocaust adequately. And so a lot of the public was ignorant about it. But a lot of people had what they call genteel anti-Semitism. That's kind of a kind way of putting it, but it's a form of acceptable prejudice that was rampant in America at the time. That today, I mean, today you can get away with saying a lot of bigoted remarks on television that you wouldn't have been able to say in the 70s, for example. I noticed when Reagan came in the 80s, suddenly people were saying things on television that were bigoted that would have gotten them fired 5 years before. So today some host will say something outrageous or some guest, and they'll still be back on TV next week.
Yeah.
And so we're back in that ballpark. But there are some things today that people wouldn't say that maybe they feel, but they don't have the license to say. But, you know, one of the problems we have today is that our id has been let loose again, and there's a lot of people, there are people waving Nazi flags, Confederate flags, etc., in public. And, you know, the head of the Marines the other day just had to say that Confederate flags are not allowed on Marine bases. I mean, you know, that we have to say this,
Right.
and that people are openly showing Nazi flags is a sign that this cancer is just hidden just below the surface, and it can pop out at any moment. That Wells would recognize that thing.
We also have a few people asking about the significance of the clocks, and I know I read a little bit about how some of the missing sequences that we talked about were intended to really drive home the metaphor that was intended. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I kind of made fun of that in my book the first time. I thought it was kind of a goofy fetish that he had with clocks. So I guess you could read some kind of symbolism into it's about fate, or, you know, the clock, the hands of destiny, or whatever. But it seems kind of silly that this guy's up tinkering with clocks all the time. And Robinson masquerades as a clock expert. But in the script, there's a scene that was probably filmed, but not in the film. It might have helped, whereas Loretta Young says, "Oh, my husband explained why he likes clocks so much." She says clocks to him represent society, the way it functions, that they have beautiful outward show, and they have, you know, artworks and angels and devils and arrows and things, and inside there's an engine which represents society functioning, and all these little gears which are the common people doing their bit, you know. So it begins to take on a more and more Nazi-like tone the more she describes what her husband believes. And it's sort of his metaphor for the smooth functioning of society as a machine. And that is a characteristic of fascism, is that society and human life are viewed as mechanical and not human. And so I think it would have helped to have her explain that, or maybe have him explain it in the film, because otherwise it just seems a little coming out of nowhere, doesn't it?
My last question's a real softball, but I'm just very curious. Out of all his films, which is your favorite?
Well, The Magnificent Ambersons. And people say why. It's hard for me to say. I think part of it is it's a Midwestern film, great film about the Midwest, and it's a film about terrible loss. It's about our country changing irrevocably. In that film, the metaphor, it's a Booth Tarkington novel that won the Pulitzer Prize. It's about the automobile destroying the old rustic America, the small town America that we used to have, with pollution and industrialization. And but it's a metaphor for the modern world. Wells was the kind of person who didn't like the modern world very much. He liked the Middle Ages. He liked medieval Spain and that kind of culture, England. He said he liked the myth of merry old England and the myth of Camelot and the myth of small town America, but he said he realizes that those places didn't really exist. But he said the fact that we can conceive of these myths is important. And you get that sense in Ambersons that there's a genteel world that is destroyed, but who is it based on? It's a rich family of people who aren't very likable, really. And the young lead is George, who's a very unlikable character, to the point where audiences can't a lot of people don't like that film because they can't relate to this guy, but that's sort of the point, and that's a very Brechtian concept too. You have a protagonist who alienates the audience. Actually, Tim Holt gives a marvelous performance. He has a certain charm despite his abrasive, destructive personality, but it's about a boy who kills his mother. It's a very disturbing theme, and Welles wrote part of an autobiography toward the end of his life for Vogue magazine, and he said he had killed his father. And his father was an alcoholic, and Welles was persuaded to abandon him, what we now call tough love. And he told his father, "I won't see you again unless you stop drinking." And his father drank himself to death in a hotel room in Chicago. And Welles claimed that he actually committed suicide. The death certificate says it was kidney and heart disease, but Welles said he never got over the guilt. And I think what he was doing, Chimes of Midnight is about a boy who kills his father, in a sense. Falstaff is the father figure. And I think he couldn't quite deal with that theme at that time, so he dealt with it in Ambersons by having the boy kill his mother. Wells's mother died when he was 9, which was terribly traumatic. But that is a real Greek tragic theme, killing a family member. It's very disturbing, and it's about dysfunctional families, which I think is a powerful theme. And the visual style, when I first saw it, I thought, wow, I've never seen a film that looks like this. It's so unusual. As James Agee said, it creates a visual suspense in the art of how it tells the story. It's just, every shot is unexpected. And it has the greatest sequence in Welles's films, the great ball sequence, the last of the great long remembered dances that everybody talked about, is what he calls it. And it's beautiful, but it's a passing world that's being destroyed. So he deals a lot with the destruction of values that we hold dear, but he also criticizes the societies that are in the process of being destroyed too. He has a very complex view of life. And Chimes of Midnight may be his greatest film. Ambersons was severely mutilated by the studio. So somebody said, how can you say it's your favorite film if 50 minutes was cut out of it and parts were reshot? And I said, well, I have a certain fondness for ruins and what the French call the film maudit, the damned film. I feel a proprietary or a tenderness toward them. Films that have problems or are rejected, I have a certain love for them. But Chimes of Midnight is a great, perfect film, made the way Welles wanted it to be made. And it's very emotional. And it's very much like Ambersons. Truffaut had a comment, maybe this is a good place to wrap it up, that he said Welles made 2 kinds of films. He said he had films in which there were gunshots and films in which there was snow. And he said his heart is in the films where there is snow, and his mind or commercial senses when he has gunshots. And if you notice, The Stranger has snow, but it has gunshots as well. So it's kind of a mixture of the two. Ambersons doesn't have any gunshots. It has beautiful snow sequences, but it's about destruction. And Chimes of Midnight has beautiful snow sequences, but it's about destruction as well.
Well, that's great. As like I said, want to dig in now. That's all I'm going to be looking for, is which ones have gunshots and which ones have snow.
Yeah, right. Thank you. That was great. Those questions were terrific. Thank you for the good questions.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks for coming. Thank you so much, Joe, for being here. This has been really great. We really appreciate it. This is the first time we're doing something like this. We often have our member screenings in person, as you would imagine.
Yeah.
This is our first at-home member screening, and I couldn't be happier to have you here to talk about it for everybody. So thank you so much for coming. And to all the members, thank you guys so much for participating. It looks like we kept your attention. Most of you stuck it out, and I really appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate being asked and being back in Milwaukee, even virtually. And I look forward to visiting you all when the festival resumes in person eventually. And
that would be great.
It's always nice to be back. And thank you for your good questions, you and the guests and all the members. It's really terrific talking to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And take care, everybody. Stay safe.
Thank you. See you later.
So long.
Bye.